I was staring out my kitchen window on a brutally cold February morning in Madison, Wisconsin, when I noticed Patricia Kensington marching across my front yard like a woman on a mission. My coffee mug froze halfway to my lips as I watched her bright pink parka cutting through the frozen landscape, her breath forming angry little clouds in the air. I knew immediately this was going to be a problem. My name is Garrison, and I had lived in the Maple Ridge subdivision for exactly 3 winters. The first 2 had been relatively peaceful, but this year, Patricia had been elected as the new president of our homeowners association, and suddenly, every minor infraction became a federal case. She was one of those middle-aged women who found purpose in making other people's lives miserable, hiding behind rules and regulations like they were divine scripture. I opened the door before she could assault my doorbell, which she was clearly preparing to do based on the aggressive way she was stomping up my porch steps. "Derek," she said sharply, not bothering with pleasantries, "we need to discuss your snow situation immediately." I glanced over at the large pile of snow that sat near the corner of my property, about 15 feet from the street. After 3 major snowstorms in 2 weeks, I had to put the snow somewhere, and that particular spot made the most sense. It was out of the way, it wasn't blocking any driveways or sidewalks, and my snow blower could easily reach it from multiple angles. "What about it?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "It's blocking the view from the street corner," Patricia announced, clutching her tablet like it contained irrefutable evidence of my crimes. According to our HOA guidelines, Section 12, Paragraph 4, no homeowner shall create any obstruction that impairs sight lines or poses a safety hazard to the community. I stepped out onto my porch, the cold immediately biting through my flannel shirt. "Patricia, that snow pile is on my property. It's not near any intersection and it's literally just snow. It'll melt in a few weeks." Her eyes narrowed. "The Henderson family from 2 streets over complained that when they're driving past your house, they can't see if cars are coming from Oakwood Drive. That's a liability issue, Derek. I'm going to have to insist you move it." I looked at the geography of my property. My house sat on a corner lot where Birch Street met Maple Avenue. The snow pile was positioned on the Maple Avenue side, a good 30 feet from the actual intersection. There was no logical way it could block anyone's view of Oakwood Drive, which was an entirely different street that intersected with Birch on the opposite end of the block. "That doesn't even make sense," I said slowly. "Oakwood Drive is nowhere near that snow pile." Patricia's face flushed red. "Are you questioning my authority as HOA president?" "I'm questioning the basic geometry of your complaint," I replied, feeling my patience starting to wear thin. "The snow pile can't block a view of a street that's 100 yards away in a completely different direction." She tapped something on her tablet with furious precision. "I'm documenting your refusal to comply. You have 48 hours to remove that snow pile, or you'll be fined $200 per day until it's gone. You can't be serious, completely serious." "This is your official warning, Derek. The HOA board has discussed this matter, and we're united in our decision. That snow pile is a hazard and an eyesore, and it needs to go." I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache forming. "Where exactly do you expect me to put several tons of snow?" "That's not my problem," Patricia said primly. "Perhaps you should have thought about that before you created such a monstrosity. Good day." She turned on her heel and marched back toward her car, which I now noticed was idling in front of my house, presumably so she wouldn't waste a single second longer than necessary in my presence. I stood there in the freezing cold for a full minute after she drove away, trying to process what had just happened. The snow pile in question was maybe 6 feet tall at its highest point and about 10 feet wide. I had specifically chosen that location because it was the safest, most logical spot on my property. The ground there had a natural depression that prevented meltwater from running toward anyone's foundation. It was far enough from the street to not interfere with plowing. It wasn't blocking any views, windows, or pathways. Moving it would mean hauling several tons of compacted snow across my yard, probably damaging my lawn in the process, and putting it somewhere that made less sense from an engineering and safety standpoint. I went back inside and called my neighbor, Frank Morrison, who had lived in Maple Ridge for 15 years and had seen multiple HOA boards come and go. "Frank, Patricia Kensington just threatened to fine me $200 a day over my snow pile," I said without preamble. Frank sighed heavily. "Yeah, she's been on a tear lately. She tried to cite me last week because my trash cans were visible from the street for more than 12 hours after pickup. Never mind that the garbage truck didn't come until 6 in the evening. What's her problem with your snow?" I explained the situation, including the bizarre claim about blocking views of a street that wasn't anywhere near the snow pile. "That's insane," Frank said. "Even for Patricia, that's reaching. Have you looked at your CC and Articus recently?" "Not since I moved in," I admitted. The covenants, conditions, and restrictions document had been a dense, 70-page legal document that I had skimmed before purchasing the house. Might want to dig into the specifics. Patricia likes to interpret things very loosely in whatever way suits her agenda. But if you can prove the snow pile isn't actually violating anything, she can't fine you. After hanging up with Frank, I spent the next 2 hours reading through the CC and Articus with a fine-toothed comb. Section 12. Paragraph 4 did indeed mention obstructions and sight lines, but it specifically referenced permanent or semi-permanent structures and vegetation exceeding 6 feet in height within 20 feet of an intersection. Snow wasn't mentioned anywhere. Temporary accumulations of any kind weren't addressed at all. I sent a carefully worded email to Patricia, citing the specific language of the CC and Articus, and pointing out that my snow pile didn't meet any of the criteria for a violation. I kept my tone professional and included photographs showing the pile's location relative to the street and the actual intersection. Her response came back within an hour. "The board has interpreted Section 12, Paragraph 4 to include any obstruction, temporary or otherwise, that could reasonably be considered a safety issue. Your argument is noted but overruled. You now have 36 hours to comply." I stared at my computer screen in disbelief. She had just unilaterally decided to change the interpretation of the rules and reduced my deadline. This was quickly spiraling from annoying to genuinely concerning. That evening, I drove to the office supply store and made copies of everything: the original CC and Articus, my photos, Patricia's emails, the whole paper trail. Then I started doing research on HOA law in Wisconsin. What I found was both encouraging and disturbing. HOAs had significant authority, but they couldn't just make up rules or interpretations on the fly. There were legal standards they had to meet, and fines had to be reasonable and directly related to actual damages or violations. The next morning, I sent a certified letter to Patricia and the HOA board stating that I would not be moving the snow pile, as it violated no actual provision of the CC and Articus as written. I also requested a formal hearing before the board, which was my right under Wisconsin HOA law. Patricia showed up at my door again that afternoon, this time with another board member in tow. A stern-looking man named Richard Pemberton who served as the HOA treasurer. "Derek, "You're making this much harder than it needs to be," Patricia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Just move the snow and we can all forget this ever happened." "I'm not moving the snow," I said firmly. "It's in the safest, most logical location on my property. Show me one legitimate reason why it needs to be moved and I'll consider it." Richard spoke up for the first time. "The reason is that the board has determined it's a violation. That's all the reason you need." "That's not how this works," I countered. "The CC and Articus are a legal contract. You can't just arbitrarily decide something is a violation when it clearly isn't." "I've requested a formal hearing, which is my right." Patricia's fake sweetness evaporated. "Fine. The board will convene next Tuesday at 7 p.m. at the community center. Be prepared to present your case, and be aware that if we rule against you, the fines will be retroactive to today." They left, and I immediately called a lawyer. The attorney, Michelle Carson, specialized in property law and had handled several HOA disputes. After listening to my situation, she was quiet for a long moment. "This is either going to be very simple or very complicated," she finally said. "If the board is reasonable, pointing out that the CC and Articus don't actually support their position should end it. But if they're determined to push this, they could make your life hell even if they're legally wrong. Do you have the resources to fight this if it goes to court?" I thought about my savings account and my job as a software developer. I can afford to fight it, but I'd rather not waste money on something this stupid. "I hear you. Let me give you some advice for the hearing. Document everything. Bring photos, bring measurements, bring evidence that the snow pile isn't causing any actual problems. And consider bringing in an expert." "What kind of expert? An engineer or a surveyor?" "Someone who can speak to whether your snow placement is actually creating any safety issues or sight line problems. It'll be harder for the board to dismiss professional testimony." The word engineer stuck in my head. That was actually brilliant. If I could get a professional to evaluate the situation and confirm that my snow pile was not only safe but arguably the safest location for it, the board would have a much harder time justifying their position. I spent the weekend making calls. Most engineering firms didn't want to bother with such a small job, but I finally found a civil engineer named Robert Hernandez, who specialized in site planning and snow management for commercial properties. When I explained the situation, he actually laughed. "An HOA is trying to fine you over a snow pile that's not blocking anything. That's a new one. Yeah, I can come take a look. I'm curious now." Robert came out on Monday morning with surveying equipment, a camera, and a clipboard full of official-looking forms. He was a stocky man in his 50s with gray hair and an easy manner that immediately put me at ease. He spent over an hour examining my property, taking measurements, checking sight lines from various positions on the street, and evaluating drainage patterns. "Okay," he said finally, packing up his equipment. "I'll have a report ready for you by tomorrow afternoon, but I can tell you right now that snow pile is probably in the single best location you could have chosen. The drainage is perfect. It's not impeding any traffic sight lines, and it's far enough from all structures that there's zero risk of ice dam formation or foundation issues. If anything, moving it to most other locations on your property would be less safe. Can you put all that in writing?" I asked hopefully. "Already planning on it. I'll include diagrams, photos, and a full analysis. If this goes to any kind of legal proceeding, you'll have solid expert testimony." Robert's report arrived via email Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon, and it was magnificent. 12 pages of detailed analysis, complete with topographical measurements, sight line diagrams, and professional photographs. His conclusion was unambiguous. The snow pile location was optimal from both a safety and practical standpoint, and relocating it would serve no useful purpose while potentially creating drainage issues. I printed 3 copies, one for myself, one for the board, and one for my lawyer, just in case. The community center meeting room was stuffy and overly warm when I arrived at 6:45 on Tuesday evening. The board sat at a folding table at the front, Patricia in the center, flanked by Richard Pemberton and 3 other board members I recognized but had never formally met. There were maybe a dozen other residents scattered in the plastic chairs, presumably there to watch the show. Patricia called the meeting to order at exactly 7 p.m., running through some standard HOA business first. Approval of last month's minutes, a discussion about repainting the playground equipment, an update on the Neighborhood Watch program. I sat through it all, my folder of documentation in my lap, trying to stay calm. Finally, Patricia looked directly at me. Now we come to the matter of Derek Garrison's non-compliance with HOA regulations regarding his snow pile. Derek, you requested this hearing. You have 15 minutes to present your case. I stood up and walked to the front, distributing copies of Robert's engineering report to each board member. Then I set up my laptop and connected it to the projector, pulling up photographs and diagrams. Thank you for your time, I began, keeping my voice steady. I want to be very clear. I have no interest in violating HOA rules or creating safety hazards, but the complaint against my snow pile is baseless, and I have evidence to prove it. I walked them through the CC and Articus first, showing exactly what Section 12, Paragraph 4 actually said and highlighting that it didn't apply to temporary snow accumulation. Then, I showed photographs proving that the snow pile wasn't blocking any legitimate sight lines. I had taken pictures from every possible angle and street position, demonstrating that visibility at all intersections remained completely unobstructed. Then came Robert's report. I summarized the key findings, emphasizing his professional credentials and the thoroughness of his analysis. A licensed civil engineer with 25 years of experience has evaluated this situation and concluded that my snow pile is not only safe but optimally located, I said. Moving it would serve no purpose except to satisfy an arbitrary demand that has no basis in our actual governing documents. Patricia's expression had grown progressively more sour as I presented. When I finished and sat down, she shuffled through the pages of Robert's report with obvious disdain. "This is all very impressive," she said coldly, "but it doesn't change the fundamental issue. The board has received complaints from residents who feel that your snow pile is unsightly and potentially hazardous. As board members, we have a duty to address those concerns." "Which residents?" I asked. "You mentioned the Henderson family, but they live 2 streets away and would have no actual view of my property during normal driving. Can you provide specifics about who complained and what their exact concerns were?" Patricia's face flushed. "That information is confidential." "Convenient," I said before I could stop myself. Richard Pemberton leaned forward. "Watch your tone, Mr. Garrison. The board doesn't have to justify our decisions to you. We're tasked with maintaining property values and community standards. Your attitude suggests a lack of respect for that authority." "My attitude reflects my frustration with being threatened with significant fines over something that violates no actual rule," I shot back. "I've provided expert testimony from a licensed engineer." "What evidence do you have that my snow pile is actually a problem?" The room fell silent. I could see other residents looking at each other, a few nodding slightly. Patricia clearly sensed she was losing the room. "The board will take this under advisement," she announced abruptly. We'll provide our decision in writing within 5 business days. This hearing is adjourned. I gathered my materials, noticing several residents approaching me as the board members quickly filed out. "That was really thorough," said a woman I recognized from a few houses down. "I'm Sandra, by the way. I got cited last month for having my Christmas lights up 3 days past the deadline. Patricia charged me a $100 fine. She tried to fine my husband for parking our work van in the driveway overnight," added another man. "Never mind that it's a regular van, not some huge commercial vehicle. She said it was unsightly." As I listened to more and more stories, a picture emerged of Patricia using the HOA as her personal fiefdom, interpreting rules in whatever way suited her preferences and targeting anyone who didn't fall in line. Frank Morrison had been right. She was on a power trip, and I was just the latest target. The board's written decision arrived exactly 5 business days later via certified mail. I opened it with a sense of dread that proved justified. After careful consideration, the board has determined that the snow pile at the property of Garrison continues to constitute a violation of Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the CC and Articles. The resident is hereby ordered to remove said snow pile within 72 hours. Failure to comply will result in fines of $200 per day until compliance is achieved. They had completely ignored the engineering report. They had ignored the actual text of the CC and Articles. They had simply reasserted their original position as if my entire presentation had never happened. I called Michelle Carson immediately. "They can't do this, right?" I asked. "I proved the snow pile isn't a violation." Michelle was quiet for a moment. "Unfortunately, they can issue the decision. Whether it's legally enforceable is another matter. Here's what's going to happen. They'll start assessing fines, you'll refuse to pay, they'll place a lien on your property, and then we'll end up in court where a judge will have to sort it out. How long will that take? Months, possibly longer. And it'll cost you several $1,000s in legal fees, even if you win." I felt my stomach sink. So they can just bully me into compliance even though they're wrong. A lot of HOAs operate that way, unfortunately. They bank on residents not having the time, money, or energy to fight back. The good news is that you have an excellent case. The bad news is that proving it will be expensive and time-consuming. I spent the next 72 hours in a state of barely controlled fury. The principle of the thing was driving me crazy. I wasn't some scofflaw trying to skirt reasonable rules. I had done everything right. I had researched the regulations, consulted an expert, presented evidence, followed the proper procedures. And still, Patricia and her board were steamrolling ahead because they could. On the morning the deadline expired, I looked out my window to see Patricia and Richard standing on the sidewalk in front of my house, taking photographs of the snow pile with their phones. The snow had actually started to melt at the edges due to a warming trend, and the pile was noticeably smaller than when this whole ridiculous saga had begun. I didn't go outside. There was no point. They wanted their confrontation, and I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. The first fine notice arrived 2 days later, $400 for 2 days of non-compliance. Then another notice the following week, $1,400 total. The amounts were accruing faster than I could process what was happening. Michelle filed a motion in Dane County Circuit Court challenging the fines and requesting an injunction against further penalties pending a full hearing. The filing fee alone was $350, and that was before her actual legal fees kicked in. We're arguing that the HOA exceeded its authority by imposing fines for something that doesn't violate the CC and Articles as written, Michelle explained. We'll also argue that their interpretation of the rules was arbitrary and capricious. Judge Morrison is hearing the case, and she's generally pretty reasonable about HOA overreach. How long until we get a hearing? I asked. Probably 6 to 8 weeks. In the meantime, the HOA will keep assessing fines, but you don't have to pay them. If we win, the judge can void all the penalties. 6 weeks felt like an eternity. The snow pile continued to melt as March arrived, and temperatures climbed above freezing more often than not. The irony wasn't lost on me. By the time we got to court, there probably wouldn't be any snow left to argue about, but something else started happening. Other residents who had been targeted by Patricia's aggressive enforcement began reaching out. Sandra, the woman from the meeting, organized a petition calling for Patricia's removal as HOA president. Within 2 weeks, over 40 households had signed it, representing more than half the homes in Maple Ridge. Frank Morrison knocked on my door one evening in mid-March holding a stack of papers. "You've become a folk hero," he said with a grin. "Everyone's talking about how you stood up to Patricia with that engineering report. People are getting organized. We're calling for a special election to recall the entire board." "Can you do that?" I asked, surprised. "It's in the bylaws." "If 30% of homeowners petition for it, we can force a special election. We've got well over that threshold. The vote is scheduled for 3 weeks from now." This was an unexpected development. I had been so focused on my legal battle that I hadn't considered the possibility of a political solution. The HOA tried to fight the special election, with Patricia sending out a lengthy email defending the board's actions and characterizing the recall effort as a coordinated attack by a small group of malcontents who refused to respect community standards. But her message landed poorly. Too many people had been on the receiving end of questionable fines or petty citations. The special election took place on a Wednesday evening in early April at the community center, the same room where I had presented my case to the board. The turnout was massive, with over 100 residents showing up to vote. I cast my ballot and then waited nervously as volunteers counted the results. It wasn't even close. Patricia, Richard, and 2 other board members were recalled by margins of more than 70%. Only one board member, a quiet woman named Ellen who had rarely spoken during meetings, retained her position. Patricia's face as the results were announced was a mixture of shock and rage. She grabbed her belongings and stormed out without a word, Richard following close behind. The new board was elected 2 weeks later in a much calmer atmosphere. Frank Morrison became the new president, with Sandra as vice president. One of their first official acts was to review all outstanding fines and citations from the previous board. Frank called me personally with the news. "The board voted unanimously to void all the fines against you. We also formally withdrew the violation notice. Your snow pile, which I notice no longer exists because it all melted, is officially not a problem." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. What about my legal fees? I'm out several $1,000s because of Patricia's vendetta. We're working on that. The new board is consulting with our HOA attorney about potential reimbursement. Patricia may have exposed the association to liability with her actions. That's still being sorted out. A week later, Michelle called with more news. "The HOA has agreed to reimburse you for your legal fees and the cost of the engineering report. They're also issuing a formal apology. In exchange, they're asking that you sign a release agreeing not to pursue further legal action against the association." "What about Patricia personally?" I asked. "That's trickier. You could potentially sue her as an individual, but it would be expensive and time-consuming, and there's no guarantee you'd recover anything." She didn't exactly act in good faith, but proving personal liability versus bad decisions made in her role as HOA president is complicated. I thought about it for a long moment. The principle still bothered me, but dragging this out for months or years in litigation seemed exhausting and pointless. The fines were gone. I was getting my money back, and Patricia had been removed from power. That was probably the best outcome I could reasonably hope for. "I'll sign the release," I said finally. The reimbursement check arrived in May, along with a formal letter from the new HOA board apologizing for the misunderstanding and overly aggressive enforcement of the previous administration. The letter was signed by Frank, Sandra, and the other new board members. I thought that was the end of it. The snow was long gone, spring had arrived with an explosion of green, and life in Maple Ridge had returned to normal. The new board was running things competently and reasonably, without Patricia's capricious enforcement and petty tyranny. But in early June, I got a call from Sandra. "Derek, we've got a problem," she said. "A big one." "What kind of problem?" "The new board has been going through the association's financial records in detail. Richard Pemberton was the treasurer under Patricia's administration, and he was supposedly managing all the money, but the numbers aren't adding up." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "What do you mean they're not adding up?" "We're missing about $43,000. Money that should be in the HOA's reserve account just isn't there. We've brought in a forensic accountant, and she's finding evidence of systematic embezzlement going back almost 2 years. "Richard was stealing from the HOA?" I asked, stunned. "It looks that way. He was writing checks to fake vendors, creating false invoices, that kind of thing. And here's where it gets worse. There are email exchanges between him and Patricia that suggest she knew about it, or at least suspected something was wrong and deliberately didn't look into it. This had escalated far beyond petty HOA disputes into actual criminal territory." "What are you going to do?" "The board is meeting with a criminal attorney tomorrow. This is police matter now. I wanted to give you a heads up because you were so directly targeted by Patricia's board. If she was trying to distract from financial irregularities by creating noise around enforcement issues, your snow pile might have been part of that strategy." I sat down heavily. My ridiculous battle over a snow pile had apparently been a sideshow to a much larger scandal. It made a sick kind of sense. Patricia's aggressive enforcement of minor violations, her unwillingness to back down even when presented with clear evidence, her need to maintain absolute control over the board. If she and Richard had been covering up embezzlement, they couldn't afford to show any weakness or allow anyone to question their authority. The news broke in the local Madison newspaper a week later. Former HOA officials under investigation for embezzlement. The article detailed how Richard Pemberton had allegedly stolen tens of thousands of dollars from the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association over a 2-year period, using his position as treasurer to mask the theft. Patricia Kensington was named as potentially being complicit, though the investigation was ongoing. I was interviewed by a detective from the Madison Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. I told him everything about my interactions with Patricia and Richard, including how aggressively they had pursued baseless fines against me. The detective listened carefully, taking notes. "It's a pattern we see sometimes in these cases," he said. "Someone's stealing money, so they create chaos and controversy to keep people distracted and to maintain an atmosphere of fear and control. If everyone's worried about getting fined for minor violations, they're less likely to question the bigger picture." "So I was just a distraction?" I asked. "Maybe not deliberately at first, but once you pushed back and started asking questions, they probably saw you as a threat. Someone willing to challenge them on one thing might start challenging them on other things. Easier to try to steamroll you into submission. Richard Pemberton was arrested in July and charged with multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud. The evidence was apparently overwhelming. Bank records, false invoices, diverted payments, the whole works. He had stolen over $50,000 in total, more than the initial estimate. Patricia wasn't charged criminally, but the investigation revealed that she had been aware of financial irregularities and failed to report them or take action. Several residents, including myself, filed a civil lawsuit against both Patricia and Richard, seeking damages for the harm their actions had caused to the association and individual homeowners. The civil case dragged on for months, but eventually, a settlement was reached. Richard agreed to repay the stolen funds as part of his plea deal on the criminal charges, and Patricia's homeowner's insurance policy covered a significant portion of the remaining damages. Richard was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months. By the time everything was finally resolved, it was January again. Almost a full year had passed since Patricia had first marched across my lawn to complain about my snow pile. I was standing at the same kitchen window, drinking coffee, watching snow fall and accumulate. This time, I had a plan. I had consulted with Robert Hernandez again, not because I needed to, but because I wanted the satisfaction of being absolutely certain. The engineer had reviewed my property with the coming winter in mind and confirmed that yes, the same location remained the optimal spot for snow storage. When the first major storm hit and I fired up my snow blower, I directed all the snow to exactly the same place as last year. The pile grew steadily over the following weeks as winter reasserted itself. This time, there were no complaints, no threatening visits, no absurd fines. Frank Morrison stopped by one afternoon in late January as I was finishing up clearing my driveway. "Nice snow pile," he said with a knowing grin. "Thanks. I had it professionally evaluated by a licensed engineer," I replied, matching his tone. "I heard about that. That was brilliant, by the way." Showing up to the board meeting with an actual engineering report. It's part of Maple Ridge legend now. We stood there for a moment, looking at the pile of snow that had started this whole mess. "You know what's crazy?" I said. "If Patricia had just left me alone, none of this would have happened. The embezzlement probably would have continued. Richard would have kept stealing. She would still be terrorizing the neighborhood over Christmas lights and trash cans." Frank nodded slowly. "That's the thing about petty tyrants. They can't help themselves. They push and push until eventually they push someone who pushes back, and then everything unravels." "I just wanted to clear my driveway," I said. "And now you're the guy who took down a corrupt HOA board," Frank laughed. "Life's funny that way." After Frank left, I went back inside and made myself another cup of coffee. Through the window, I could see my snow pile sitting peacefully in its optimal location, backed by engineering analysis and free from HOA interference. It was just a pile of snow, completely mundane and ordinary. But it represented something more, proof that standing up to arbitrary authority, even over something as stupid as snow placement, mattered. Documentation mattered. Expert analysis mattered. Not backing down when you were in the right mattered. The house across the street, Patricia's old house, had a "for sale" sign in the yard. She and her husband had moved out shortly after the scandal broke, relocating to somewhere in Illinois according to neighborhood gossip. I didn't wish her ill exactly, but I couldn't say I was sad to see her go. New neighbors moved into Patricia's old house in February. A young couple with a toddler and a friendly golden retriever. They introduced themselves one weekend, and we chatted pleasantly about the neighborhood. They mentioned they had read the HOA documents carefully before buying and were pleased to see the new board seemed reasonable. "We heard there was some drama with the previous board," the husband said cautiously. "You could say that," I replied with a slight smile, "but it's all sorted out now. The current board is great, very reasonable people." I didn't mention my role in the drama. It didn't seem necessary. The story had taken on a life of its own in neighborhood gossip, growing more elaborate with each retelling. I had heard versions where I had single-handedly investigated the embezzlement, or where I had dramatically confronted Patricia at a board meeting. The truth was more mundane. I had just refused to move a snow pile and insisted on documentation and evidence. March arrived with warmer temperatures, and my snow pile began its inevitable melt. I watched the process with a sort of fond amusement. This pile of frozen water had cost me thousands of dollars in legal fees, dozens of hours of stress and frustration, and had somehow been the catalyst for exposing municipal-level corruption. Robert Hernandez called me in early April with an unexpected proposition. "Derek, I've been thinking about your situation," he said. "Would you be interested in me writing up a case study about the snow pile analysis?" Obviously, I would change names and location details, but it's actually a really good example of practical site engineering, and also of how technical analysis can resolve disputes. I think it could be useful for other engineers, and also for people dealing with HOA issues. "Sure," I said, flattered. "As long as you don't make me identifiable. I've had enough local fame to last a lifetime." "Perfect. I'll send you a draft before I publish anything." The case study appeared a few months later in a professional engineering journal and then, surprisingly, got picked up by a property law blog. It became a minor internet sensation, in the very specific niche of people interested in HOA disputes. I got several emails from people around the country who were fighting their own battles with overzealous homeowners associations, thanking me for showing that it was possible to push back successfully. I tried to help where I could, mostly by emphasizing the importance of documentation and expert testimony. Several people hired engineers or surveyors to evaluate their own situations based on my example, and at least a few reported back that the professional analysis had been enough to get their HOAs to back down. The Maple Ridge HOA under Frank's leadership settled into a comfortable rhythm. They enforced rules that actually mattered, maintaining properties, keeping common areas clean, ensuring safety standards. They ignored the petty stuff that had consumed Patricia's attention. No one got fined for trash, cans being visible for an extra day, or Christmas lights staying up slightly too long. Property values in the neighborhood actually increased, which surprised some of the old guard who had believed that strict enforcement was necessary to maintain standards. Turned out that people valued living in a community where the HOA was reasonable and functional more than they valued draconian enforcement of arbitrary rules. I continued living in my house on the corner of Birch and Maple, weathering the seasonal changes. Each winter brought new snow, and each time I created my pile in the same professionally vetted location. It became something of a neighborhood landmark, with people occasionally walking by just to see the famous snow pile. My lawn recovered from any damage caused by snow storage, the grass growing thick and green each spring. I installed better drainage based on some of Robert's suggestions, which helped manage the meltwater even more efficiently. The whole property was probably in better shape than it had been before the dispute started. On a sunny afternoon in November, almost 2 years after Patricia's initial complaint, I was raking leaves when a car pulled up and a woman got out. She was middle-aged, professionally dressed, and carrying a tablet. My heart sank for just a moment before I realized she wasn't Patricia. "Mr. Garrison, I'm Jennifer Wu. I'm with a property management company out of Milwaukee. I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all," I said cautiously. "What can I do for you?" "I read the case study about your snow management dispute," she said, "and I wanted to ask if you would be willing to consult on an HOA governance training program we're developing. We're trying to teach board members how to handle complaints and enforcement properly, using evidence and reasonable standards rather than arbitrary decisions. Your situation is a perfect example of what not to do, and also of how residents can protect themselves." I was taken aback. "I'm not an expert on HOA governance. I'm a software developer. But you went through the process of properly documenting your position, getting expert analysis, and challenging an unfair decision through appropriate channels," Jennifer said. "That's exactly the kind of knowledge we want to share. We would pay you as a consultant, of course." I thought about it. The idea of turning my frustrating experience into something useful appealed to me. If I could help other people avoid the stress and expense I had gone through, or help HOA boards learn to function more reasonably, that seemed worthwhile. "Let me think about it," I said. "Can you send me more details about what you're envisioning?" Jennifer sent over a proposal later that week. They wanted me to participate in developing training materials and potentially speak at a few seminars about my experience. The compensation was surprisingly generous for what amounted to part-time work. I ended up agreeing, and over the next several months, I worked with Jennifer's team to create a comprehensive guide for homeowners facing HOA disputes. We emphasized documentation, understanding governing documents, getting expert opinions when appropriate, and knowing when to escalate to legal action versus when to compromise. The training program launched in the spring and was surprisingly well received. Multiple HOAs across Wisconsin and neighboring states brought us in to train their boards. I did 3 speaking engagements, which was nerve-wracking at first but got easier with practice. Standing in front of a room full of HOA board members and explaining how Patricia's board had gone wrong felt almost therapeutic. Some board members got defensive, insisting their associations weren't like that. Others nodded along and asked thoughtful questions about how to improve their own processes. A few came up afterward to share their own horror stories about HOA overreach, either as perpetrators who regretted their actions or as victims of other boards. The work was meaningful in a way my regular job sometimes wasn't. I was helping create real change in how these organizations functioned, potentially saving thousands of people from the frustration and expense I had experienced. Back in Maple Ridge, life continued its normal patterns. The new HOA board was re-elected without opposition. Richard Pemberton was released on parole after serving 15 months and quietly moved to another state. Patricia remained in Illinois, and I never heard from her again. My snow pile became an annual tradition, appearing each winter in the exact same spot and melting each spring without incident. Neighbors would occasionally joke about it, and new residents would sometimes hear the story and ask me about it. I kept my responses brief and factual, not wanting to embellish or dramatize what had happened. The one lasting change was my relationship with Frank Morrison and others in the neighborhood who had banded together during the recall effort. We formed a sort of informal community group, meeting every few months to discuss neighborhood issues and keep tabs on the HOA board to ensure things stayed on track. It wasn't that we didn't trust Frank and Sandra, but the experience with Patricia had taught us all the value of engaged oversight. 3 years after the initial snow pile complaint, I got a letter from Robert Hernandez. He had retired from active engineering work and was teaching part-time at the University of Wisconsin. He invited me to speak to one of his classes about the intersection of engineering analysis and legal disputes. I accepted and found myself standing in front of 30 civil engineering students, telling the story of how their field had intersected with my homeowners association drama. I brought photos, showed Robert's original report, and walked them through how his professional analysis had been crucial to defending my position. The students asked excellent questions about documentation standards, liability issues, and the responsibility of engineers when their work might be used in legal proceedings. It reminded me that technical expertise wasn't just about building things or solving problems in isolation, but about how that knowledge could be applied in real-world situations with real consequences. After the class, a young woman approached me. "That was really cool," she said. "I never thought about how engineering could be used to resolve neighborhood disputes. Do you think there are other applications for that kind of analysis?" "Definitely," I said. "Property disputes, zoning issues, construction disagreements, all sorts of things. Having solid technical data makes everything clearer and more defensible." She thanked me and hurried off to her next class. Robert walked me back to the parking lot, looking pleased. "You're good at this teaching thing," he said. "Ever thought about doing more of it?" "Not really my field," I replied. "But I have to admit, it's satisfying. Keep it in mind. We need people who can bridge the gap between technical knowledge and practical application, especially in areas like HOA management, where there's so much potential for conflict." Driving home, I reflected on how much had changed since that cold February morning when Patricia had marched across my lawn. What had started as an absurd dispute over snow placement had led to exposing embezzlement, reforming an HOA board, consulting on governance training, and now guest lecturing at a university. The next winter was milder than usual, with less snow overall. My pile was correspondingly smaller, almost anticlimactic. But I still placed it in the same spot, now certified by years of practice and professional analysis as optimal. Frank Morrison stopped by during a light snowfall in January, holding 2 cups of coffee from the local cafe. "Thought you might want a warm drink while surveying your domain," he said, handing me one. We stood on my porch, watching the snow drift down peacefully. "You ever regret not just moving the snow pile that first time?" Frank asked. "Would have saved you a lot of hassle." I considered the question seriously. Sometimes. It was expensive and stressful and took up way too much of my time, but ultimately no. If I had just complied, Patricia would have kept terrorizing people, Richard would have kept stealing, and nothing would have changed. Sometimes standing your ground over something small is actually standing up for something bigger. "Philosophy from snow management," Frank said with a grin. "Who would have thought?" "Engineering from snow management," I corrected. "Philosophy is too abstract." This was just about data and analysis and not backing down when you're right. "Fair point. How's the consulting work going?" "Good. We've got 3 more HOAs signed up for training next quarter. Jennifer thinks we might expand into other states by next year." "Look at you, HOA reform advocate." "It's quite the career pivot," I laughed. "It's a side project, not a career, but it's satisfying work. How's the board running?" "Smooth. We had one guy try to submit a complaint about his neighbor's fence being 2 inches too tall according to his measurements. We sent someone out to actually measure it properly. Turned out the fence was fine. Guy was just being petty. We thanked him for his concern and moved on." "The way it should work," I said. "The way it should work," Frank agreed. We finished our coffee in comfortable silence, watching the snow accumulate. It was a peaceful moment, unmarked by drama or conflict. Just two neighbors sharing coffee on a winter day, which was really all HOA life should be. Ordinary people maintaining a pleasant community without unnecessary complexity or power games. The legal settlement with Patricia and Richard was finalized that spring. After all the lawyers took their fees, each homeowner in Maple Ridge received a check for about $800, representing their share of the recovered funds and damages. It wasn't a fortune, but it felt like justice nonetheless. I used my settlement money to install a new patio in my backyard, positioned to catch the evening sun. It seemed fitting, taking money that resulted from the snow pile saga and investing it in enjoying my property. 4 years after the initial dispute, the Madison newspaper did a follow-up story on HOA reform efforts in the area. They interviewed me, Frank, Sandra, and several other people involved in various disputes across Dane County. The reporter was particularly interested in how my case had helped spark broader changes in HOA governance. "You think HOAs serve a useful purpose?" the reporter asked me. "They can," I said carefully. "When they maintain common areas, organize community events, and enforce reasonable standards that protect property values, they're great. The problem is when they become vehicles for petty tyrants or when boards lose sight of their actual purpose." What advice would you give to someone facing an unreasonable HOA demand? Document everything. Read your governing documents thoroughly. Get expert opinions if appropriate. Try to resolve things reasonably first, but don't be afraid to stand your ground if you're clearly right. And get involved in your HOA governance. Attend meetings, vote in elections, run for the board if you can. The associations work better when engaged homeowners participate. The article ran with photos of my house and, yes, my snow pile from the most recent winter. The headline was "How One Man's Fight Over Snow Led to HOA Reform." It was a bit sensationalized, but the content was fair and accurate. I got more emails after the article published, mostly supportive. A few people accused me of being a troublemaker or of undermining legitimate HOA authority, but those were in the minority. Most people recognized the difference between reasonable governance and arbitrary overreach. Life settled into a rhythm. Winters brought snow, which I piled in the same location each year. The HOA functioned smoothly under reasonable leadership. I continued consulting on HOA governance issues as a side project. My regular job as a software developer paid the bills and kept me intellectually engaged. The corner lot where I lived became a sort of symbol in Maple Ridge of the community's evolution from Patricia's authoritarian regime to Frank's collaborative approach. New residents heard the story and sometimes asked to see the spot, which amused me to no end. It was just a patch of ground, no different from any other part of my yard, except for what it represented. 5 years after the dispute began, I was invited to speak at a national property law conference in Chicago. The organizers wanted me to discuss the intersection of HOA governance and homeowner rights, using my experience as a case study. It was the biggest speaking engagement I had done, and I was genuinely nervous. The ballroom held about 200 people: lawyers, property managers, HOA board members, and homeowners advocates. I walked them through the timeline of my dispute, showed Robert's engineering report, discussed the legal strategy Michelle Carson had employed, and talked about the unexpected discovery of embezzlement that had resulted from the increased scrutiny. The queue and a session afterward was lively. People wanted to know about specific legal strategies, about how to find expert witnesses, about warning signs of HOA corruption. One woman stood up and said, "I'm an HOA president, and this story terrifies me. How do I make sure I never become Patricia Kensington?" It was a great question, and I tried to give her a thoughtful answer. Stay accountable. Listen to homeowners even when you disagree with them. Follow your governing documents as written, not as you wish they were written. Get second opinions on major decisions. And remember that your job is to serve the community, not to control it. She nodded, looking thoughtful. Several people applauded. After the conference, I flew back to Madison feeling like I had accomplished something meaningful. What had started as a frustrating personal dispute had evolved into a platform for advocating reasonable HOA governance. It wasn't something I had sought out or planned, but it felt right. The snow pile appeared again that winter, and again the next. Each time, I smiled at the routine nature of it. No drama, no complaints, no certified letters or threatening fines. Just snow being placed in a sensible location, exactly as engineering principles suggested it should be. Frank Morrison served 3 terms as HOA president before stepping down, satisfied that the association was on solid footing. Sandra took over, bringing the same reasonable and collaborative approach. The patterns Patricia had established were thoroughly dismantled, replaced by functional governance that actually served the community. I never heard from Patricia Kensington again. Sometimes I wondered if she ever reflected on what had happened, whether she recognized how her need for control had led to her downfall. But mostly, I didn't think about her at all. She was a chapter in my life that had closed, leaving behind lessons learned but no lasting bitterness. The consulting work with Jennifer Wu's firm continued to grow. We expanded into 5 states, training dozens of HOA boards on effective governance. The materials we developed were adopted by several property management companies as standard practice. It felt good to know that my experience was helping prevent others from going through similar ordeals. 7 years after the initial snow pile complaint, I was working from home on a cold December afternoon when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find a young man in his 20s holding a microphone and accompanied by a cameraman. "Mr. Garrison, I'm Tyler Chen from Whisk TV. We're doing a segment on the anniversary of the Maple Ridge HOA scandal, and we'd love to get your perspective." I almost said no, tired of revisiting the story. But Tyler seemed earnest and sincere, and I figured one more interview wouldn't hurt. We filmed outside with my snow pile from the current winter visible in the background. Tyler asked about the original dispute, the engineering report, the eventual discovery of embezzlement, and the reforms that had followed. "You think HOAs can really change?" Tyler asked. "Or is abuse of authority inevitable in these organizations?" "I think people can change systems if they're willing to put in the work," I said. "It takes engaged homeowners who pay attention and hold leaders accountable. It takes board members who remember they're servants of the community, not rulers of it. And it takes willingness to stand up when something's wrong, even when it's inconvenient or expensive." The segment aired that evening. I watched it with a mix of pride and embarrassment, still not entirely comfortable seeing myself on television. But the message was good. Communities could reform themselves, reasonable governance was possible, and individuals standing up for what was right could make a real difference. As winter deepened and my snow pile grew, I reflected on everything that had stemmed from Patricia's initial complaint. The legal battle, the HOA reform, the consulting work, the speaking engagements, all of it traced back to my decision not to move a pile of snow that was optimally and safely located according to professional engineering analysis. I had learned that expertise matters, that documentation is crucial, that standing your ground when you're right sometimes leads to unexpected places. I had learned that small battles over seemingly trivial things can be proxies for larger issues of authority and accountability. And I had learned that communities work better when governed by reason and evidence rather than arbitrary power. The snow pile sat outside my window, a modest mound of frozen precipitation that had somehow become a symbol of all those lessons. Next winter would bring more snow, and I would place it in the same spot again, continuing a tradition that had meaning far beyond its practical purpose. Frank Morrison walked by during his evening constitutional and waved. Sandra drove past and honked her horn in greeting. My neighbors across the street, the ones who had bought Patricia's old house, were building a snowman with their daughter. It was an ordinary winter evening in an ordinary neighborhood, which was exactly how it should be. Inside, I made dinner and settled in for the evening. Outside, my professionally certified, optimally located snow pile sat peacefully on my property, bothering no one and blocking no views. It would melt in spring, return next winter, and continue the cycle indefinitely. And that was perfectly fine with me.